perspective that is centered on our Heavenly Parents and being able to look at the societal issues of today through those lens. And it's really inspired, it's been inspiring every time he's given a sermon regarding this. And it's a really great experience, an opportunity for us to expand our horizon and really try to use the minds that were given by God to really see the true way of looking at the issues of this world today. So without further ado, I want to welcome up Uncle Jim.
Good morning. Thank you for being here, and thank you for inviting me again to give a talk. It's really an honor to be invited to speak here. And Happy New Year! So today I'm going to give a talk called A Principal View of U.S. History, Part 2. I've been working on this for a few years. As you know, I'm trying very hard to understand God's point of view on American history. There's been thousands of books written about American history, and I've written about 80% of them. No. I've read a lot of them. And I do keep up with the news. And what I'm hoping is that when you listen to this presentation, if you follow the one that I gave last time, which is now available to watch on YouTube, and this one, the next one, until I finish, I hope you'll begin to think about events in our country differently. I can tell you, doing this work has really changed my view on events in America. It's changed my sensitivities and my awareness and my way of thinking about what's going on. We live in a very important transitional time. And by the time I get to the end of this presentation series, we're going to have a very clear understanding of the significance of our time and how this time fits in with the flow of U.S. history. It's going to be very clear to us. Okay. I'm ready when you are, Mansu. Okay. A Principled Understanding of U.S. History, Part 2. I've been developing this as part of my project, which has been started 3 years ago, called the Higher Purpose Forum, and I've received a lot of assistance from my brother, Reverend Edgerly, who lives in Washington, D.C., who's been a great asset, and we've been working together on developing this content. We have meetings about twice a month on Saturdays, Zoom meetings. Many of you have been coming to those meetings where we discuss this stuff. If you have not been receiving invitations to join our meetings, please let me know, give me your email address, and I will put you on our email list, and you'll get invited to the next one. Our next talk is called, What Can Unificationism Learn from Early Christian History? And that talk is being given by Professor Michael Mickler from Unification Seminary. That's our next Higher Purpose Forum meeting. It'll be sometime this month. Here's the outline for the project on U.S. history. Last time I spoke, which was December 11th, I gave section 1, Providential Context for U.S. history. We talked about human origins, human migration and reconvergence, the providential perspective on our country, and the issue of tribalism, which I believe is the real challenge in our country. People use the word racism for every single problem that comes up. It's not very convincing to me. We do have a problem. It's more accurately described as tribalism, which is a much deeper problem than racism. And racism is a subset of that. But we can't really accurately diagnose what's going on in our country, in my opinion, according to the principle, if we think just in terms of skin color, race. It's way deeper than that. It has a long, long history. The history of the challenges we're facing in this country go back to the very origins of human migration. And this country is a very important part of the story of human migration. The second section, which I'll talk about today, is U.S. history. What's the holdup? There's 4 sections. There's actually 5 phases in U.S. history for us to understand. The divided foundation period, the divided nation period, the Jim Crow period, and the civil rights period, and we're now in the 5th period. I was thinking I was going to get through all of these periods today, but actually I'm only going to get through 2. I hope to get, the best I'll do is to get through the divided foundation period and the divided nation period, because if I rush through, especially the divided nation period, you'll miss some of the key concepts of what I believe is the providential view of our country. So I'm not going to rush through this. And I believe that's what Sun Hyung has advised me to do in general. So I hope I'm invited to give the rest of this. We'll see. All right. The last meeting, we talked for an hour, but the last meeting I explained about this whole issue of human origins and human migration, and I presented an understanding that what's happened in America is that the 3 primary tribes have converged here, and this is the place in human history where tribal reconvergence and tribal melding must take place for the benefit of the rest of the world. What's going on in our country we call a prototype situation, so that other places where there's tribal antagonisms can learn from what we accomplish here in America. But America is a long way from finalizing the process of tribal reconvergence. We're working on it, and it's been very hard for our country. That's why there's these 5 stages, because our history keeps getting prolonged, because this process of tribal reconvergence has been a big challenge in the history of our country. The Asian Americans came across the Bering Strait 13,000 years ago. The ancestors of the original Asian migrants to come into America are still exist. They're a tribe in Siberia, the Chukchi tribe. And anthropologists believe that only about 15 or 20 Homo sapien migrants actually succeeded in crossing the Bering Straits and coming. And within 800 years, they had multiplied and moved and migrated all the way down to the southern end of South America. It's an amazing story of this tribe's dissemination into North and Central and South America. And then 400 years ago, the European Americans and the Asian Americans came. They came at the same time. The Europeans didn't get here any earlier than we came together by boat. So these are the 3 founding tribes: Asian American, American Indians, some people, or Indigenous Americans, European Americans, that's me, and African Americans, that's like Darrell Clark or Zachary Oliver or Martin Luther King. Those are, sorry? Eric Brewster. These are the forefathers, the founding shareholders of America, and they're very important people. I consider myself an important person because I've been here my ancestors came on the Mayflower, the Alden family. By the way, there's millions of ancestors of the Alden family, so it's nothing special. Millions. They settled in Duxbury, so if you go to Duxbury, you can see John Alden's house, and I know 7 people who are descended from the Aldens, so it's nothing real special. Okay. Uh-oh, man, Mansu, I'm having a problem here. It's not changing. Okay. Now, the issue about tribalism is that there's 3 tribes came, and tribalism is as old as human history. It has both plus and minus features. Tribalism has both healthy and unhealthy behaviors. The power of tribalism, the ability of the Europeans to work together and the African Americans to work together in promoting their tribal interests is what's built this country. Tribalism isn't only a bad thing. Tribalism has a very negative connotation. It has a reason for having a negative connotation because there's all sorts of toxic aspects of tribalism, but there's also many very productive and healthy aspects of tribalism. So it's a mixed bag. And if you want to understand America, I think you have to understand the dynamics of tribalism. And my tribe, the European tribe, has both these very productive aspects, and we've demonstrated that in U.S. history, and also has very toxic aspects, which have also been characteristic in U.S. history. Both. Every tribe has Abel and Cain type or positive, healthy and toxic type characteristics. It's true all over the world. But it's on display here in America because this is where the tribes came to learn to reconverge and work together as God's is one human family under God. This is where we have to work it out between our tribes. Monsu, I'm having a problem. Okay. So in the United States, what we've had is we've sort of had 4 centuries, 400 years of domination by a single tribe. It's been dominated by the European tribe. We have dominated the other 2 tribes. And God gave this country 2 very specific methods for transcending this problem of tribalism, for helping our tribes work together. There's 2 things that 2 endowments we received in history to help us transcend the problems of toxic tribalism. Change? And they are Christianity or Christian love combined with democracy. Now, in unificationism, we give democracy mixed reviews because we don't think it's the ideal form of governance. But I'm convinced that the only way that you overcome tribalism is by establishing a democracy. Because in a democracy, if it's set up successfully, every single individual has the same rights. That's a Christian concept, right? The inalienable rights of every single individual. And what's happened in this country is it's taken us 400 years to set up democracy correctly, and it is still being challenged because a lot of people don't really like the implications of living democratically. It's much easier to live tribalistically than to live democratically. If you live democratically, you have to take seriously the fact that God created all of us to be his children. We're all of equal value before God. That's an extremely difficult thing for me to do. For me to take every single individual as having the same, thank you, having the same value and rights as me. That's a tough thing for me as a European American to do. My ancestors did not think that way. Creating democracy has been extremely challenging for this country. So these presentations are primarily about the story of the development of democracy, true democracy in this country. Until we overcome tribalism, we are stuck with democracy and we have to make it work. And there's things going on in our country right now that are testing the question of whether the power of tribalism is going to be able to overcome the power of democracy. Whether our democratic institutions can be overwhelmed by tribalistic behavior. And I'm not going to get into current American politics today, but there's a lot of tribalistic behavior in this country right now, which is definitely threatening our democratic institutions. If you watch the news, you'll see that every aspect of our democracy is now under threat. And it's under threat by a tribe. So this issue of tribalism in our country, challenging democracy, is a central issue in the news today. If you really look at what happened on January 6th, that's what's going on. January 6, 2020. To learn more about this, I suggest that you watch a video by Brian Klaas called How Tribalism is Killing Democracy. Now, a lot of us, including myself, you might not agree with the politics of Brian Klaas, but the comments that he makes about tribalism are very insightful. There's a lot of scholarship right now about this issue. So we're going to talk in this presentation about the period from 1620 to 1791, which I call the Divided Foundation period, 1791 to 1877, which I call the Divided Nation period, 1877 to 955, the Jim Crow period, 1955 to 2020, the Civil Rights period, and then we have a question about what happens beginning in 2020. To begin today's presentation, I'd like to read my metaphorical understanding of what's going on in American history. Of course, a lot of you know that I love the ocean. I love waves because I love to go surfing. Just in December was surfing in Honolulu Bay in Hawaii. I'd like to take time to read this carefully. You might not understand this because it's abstract, but by the end of our session, you might become clearer what this meaning of this text is. The progressive eras of providential history in America resemble forceful ocean waves at the forefront of an incoming ocean tide. One after the other, the waves crash and wash up upon the incline of a sandy shore. Each wave faces uphill resistance at the shoreline. Its force is dissipated, and then it is pushed back into the churning sea. But slowly, steadily, wave after wave, the tide advances forward, continuing its progress upon the steep shore. Behind it, the sea level slowly rises. The tide slowly rises, expecting to eventually reach the predestined high water mark. The immutable force behind the flooding ocean tide is not within the water itself, but rather that force comes from the unceasing pull of the bright but distant moon. Within the providential setting, there appears to be two forces working in opposition to one another. Many labels have been used to characterize these two forces, but most essentially, one force supports and favors, while the other force resists and seeks to prolong the inevitable advance of the rising tide. I bet Peggy Brewster knows exactly what I'm saying here. Right, Peggy? Okay. It might be, the analogy here might be very clear to some of us and not clear to others, but I think as we go forward, this will become clear as to why I think of U.S. history in this way. So we mentioned that these two tribes arrived together by boat. This tribe came much earlier across the Bering Strait, and the first period of U.S. history can be called the tribal arrival and integration period. This is, I believe, what God expected to happen during the first phase of U.S. history. That when the enslaved Americans and European Americans came and became colonists, they would learn to integrate and create a society, and then there would be a founding of a new nation, a prototype nation that would be a very significant nation in God's providence, directly related to the issue that we called building Chunilguk, very centrally related to the providence of building what we call as unificationists Chunilguk. It's very important to appreciate that when the European colonists came with their vision of building a city, of being a city on a hill visible to all people in the world, that they brought with them a social awakening that was going on in Europe. They came to America because of an awakening that was happening in Europe called the Pilgrim Awakening. This Pilgrim Awakening is one of the first kind of great awakenings that has affected our culture. It's very important we understand this Pilgrim Awakening. It was a failure in England. It only lasted 30 years, and it fizzled because it couldn't overcome the resistance of the Anglican Church. But it had a foundational effect on the core culture of what became America. 30,000 Puritans came to New England alone. That's a lot of people. And they came with religious motivation. So between the years 1620 and 1630, 30,000 Puritans who were motivated by this awakening came to colonize New England. And New England was the most influential colony. The New England colonies were kind of the cultural leaders of early colonial America. There's three sections: the New England colonies, the Mid-Atlantic colonies, and the Southern colonies. And the New England colonies were kind of like the leading intellectual and spiritual force, and I guess the second area of significance was the Southern colonies centered upon Virginia, and then the Mid-Atlantics were more diverse, so they were less effective socially, spiritually, and politically. America was born as an awakening, a reaction to hierarchy in the Anglican Church. The Puritan awakening gave America its cultural core. This is still relevant today. Still relevant today. This awakening came with a theology, a polity, that means an understanding of government, and a social theory. If you're interested in learning about this more, I would suggest this book by William McLaughlin called Revivals, Awakening and Reform. The Puritan awakening that started in England, and people motivated by this awakening left England to get away from the church. They originally pushed out of England and went to Holland. So the first Puritan pilgrims came from Holland. They went from England to Holland to New England. But then after that, they came directly from England to New England and then to the rest of the colonies. I'm simplifying a lot of history here because actually before the New England colony, there are colonies in Virginia. But I'm kind of skipping over that for the sake of just explaining this story. The worldview of the Puritan awakening can be seen as America's cultural core. It was a rejection of Anglicanism, a rejection of the divine right of kings, of the rule of bishops over the church, of the use of taxes and regulation to control the middle class. Do these things still exist in England? Yes, they do, except for the third one. But they still have a monarchy. They still have a very hierarchical Anglican church. This Reformation flopped in England, but it became the core of American colonialism. The idea of a congregational polity, you might remember that Sun Hyung Miller, our assistant pastor, gave a sermon on the meaning of the congregational polity a few months ago. This idea of local governance as opposed to governance from a central authority. We have more or less, well, I guess I don't want to simplify that too much, but we're working on developing a congregational polity for this community. The Protestant work ethic, which is really a function of Calvinism. So Puritanism is a variant of Calvinism. Millennialism, that means the belief in providential history, that we're part of a providential, that comes out of Puritanism, still in America today, very clearly. It's not just unifications to think like that by any stretch. It's a core theme in American history, is this idea of this country. The current term that people use, which drives me crazy, I don't like it, is American exceptionalism. That is not very descriptive to me. But we do have a millennialist mentality in this country, a concept that our country has providential significance and a responsibility in history that it must fulfill. And that fulfillment is still ahead of us. That's a key understanding here. There's no point as Americans in us looking back in the past and trying to make our country like it was in the past. That is not where it's at for God. We have a long way to go in the future to become better than we are now as a Christian, democrat, universally spiritual, democratic country. The idea of individual autonomy before God without the need for intervention, the covenant ideal between God and his people, separation of church and state that comes from the Pilgrim. Separation of church and state was not the idea of Thomas Jefferson. That's an idea that comes from Puritanism. Inalienable God-given rights, human determination over the course of history, governance based on consent. That's a profound idea back in the 1600s that came from Puritanism. The African Americans, as you know, came as an enslaved people. They came over on slave ships. And this is the very low point of the what's called the Middle Passage, whereby our African American co-founders arrived on slave ships, was the very, very lowest point in African American history. If you could think of the history of our African American ancestors sort of slowly becoming elevated, and this is the cellar where they started from, arriving chained inside the hold of slave ships. Many people died in that passage. The experience of being transported on these slavers was even worse than slavery. Here's a quote. Owners of the ships divided their hulls into holes with little headroom so as to transport as many slaves as possible. Unhygienic conditions meant that from 1 in 6 up to a third of the slaves would die on such a voyage. Total inhumanity. The ships transported hundreds of slaves, chained tightly to plank beds. They were held in cargo holds with little room to move, and it took months. They sat down there in chains for months as they crossed the Atlantic Ocean. It's an incredible story. I've been to seminars where people vividly describe what it was like for these, and you want to throw up just listening to it. That's where they began when they arrived in America. Sometimes when they were allowed to come up on deck to breathe if they were sick, the slaves on these would just jump overboard to commit suicide because they couldn't imagine going back into the hold. So that's kind of the beginning point for the African American descendants who came to our country. The divine principle on page 303 describes the society which God would like humans to build. We know these phrases, right? A society based upon universally shared values, mutual prosperity, and interdependence. This comes out of the Divine Principle book. These are the ideals of the society that God wants to build, and this is, in a sense, is a guideline for what we should do here in America. So the goal of nation building, the goal of building this prototype nation should follow these ideas of universally shared values, mutual prosperity, and interdependence. This is the principal terminology. If I'm going to put that into U.S. terminology, I would just change the wording a little bit, and I would say that the society that God wants us to build here in America is based upon universal citizenship rights, equal opportunity, and social integration. That's the U.S. terminology that I believe conveys the essence of these three principles. And this is what God wanted Americans to share: universal citizenship rights, equal opportunity, social integration. As it turns out, the key to these two is citizenship, universal citizenship rights. If you're truly treated as a full, equal citizen in our country, then you would have access to opportunity and to resources, and you would be socially integrated if you were treated as a true brother and sister in this republic. If you want to further break down what God is trying to accomplish here, and what are universal citizenship rights in practical terms, my research teaches me that they are universal suffrage. That means everybody gets to vote. Is there a battle in this country going on right now about voting? Is there a battle going on in this country right now? It's almost war. It's huge. This issue is still unresolved in our country. This is a huge, when you listen to the news, this is going to come up almost every night. Voting rules, ballot boxes, electoral integrity. This is a huge issue. Is everyone allowed to vote? All God's children allowed to vote in this country? That has to do with establishing universally shared values, universal citizenship rights. Equal protection under the law. Does everyone in this country receive equal justice? Is that an issue in our country? It comes up every day. Right now there's a question about whether the former president of the United States is above the law. That's what's going on in the January 6th Commission. Is a president subject to the same laws as I am? It's one example of this issue of equal protection under the law. And the third, I would say, is fair trials by peers. In other words, if you go in a courtroom, if Dennis goes into a courtroom and he's done something wrong, and all the jury are people like me, that's not a trial by his peers. That's an unfair trial. He's going to be found guilty. I'm just telling, because this has happened in U.S. history a million times. People have had unfair trials, and therefore they've been incarcerated unfairly, unjustly. So, fair trial by our peers, everyone receiving an equal trial by their peers is an aspect of universal citizenship rights. Equal opportunity means equal access to resources. And in the early years of our country, equal access to resources primarily meant being able to own land and receive an education. Huge issues in U.S. history. Whether you could own land, whether you could receive a quality education, the same quality, it says they're equal, the same quality of education as your other countrymen. That's part of citizenship rights, is equal access to land and education. And then the third thing that came up eventually, there's other aspects of resources, but the next thing that comes up is housing discrimination. Thirdly, social integration. And this is the issue that we're going up against right now in our country primarily. Treatment, social integration requires that everybody be treated with full human dignity. Amen? We need to successfully establish these processes, these traditions, if we're going to build Chanilaguk. And we have to accomplish it in a country where there's white people, black people, yellow people, green people. We have to find a way to share all this together if we're going to build the kind of world that God expects. So we see that the arrival of the first African American slaves and the European colonists arrived in 1619, 1620. The Asian Americans from Central Asia were already here. And during this initial period, the expectation was that the founding of a prototype nation would take place based upon the combination of Christian love and democracy. The founders of our country, founding fathers, definitely said that without moral Christian love, that democracy would fail. Do you remember John Adams saying that? I should have the quote here, but the two of them go hand in hand. They are functions of one another. And that founding prototype nation would encapsulate these values of universal citizenship rights, equal opportunity, and social integration. Now, you could say, well, wait a minute, they came as slaves. How's that going to work? Well, the original concept of the labor that came over from England and from Africa was the idea of indentured servitude. Now, I've read, it's kind of hard to do research on this, and I'm but I have found several sources that stated that not only did Europeans come over to be indentured servants, but the original concept of the enslaved Africans was also that they would come here and be indentured servants. That was the original idea. For 11 years. You heard 7. So the idea is that you come over here, your transport is paid for, you're taken care of, you're giving housing and clothes, you work for 7 years or 11 years, and then you earn your freedom. And then once you earn your freedom, then the next step is to go through the process of becoming a citizen. That was the original concept of indentured servitude. So that everyone, ideally, at the very beginning, could become a citizen with equal rights. But what happened is, in the southern colonies, now I'm really simplifying a lot of history here, but the southern colonies were more kind of economically motivated by, especially Virginia, than the New England colonies. And a gentleman named John Rolfe came over, and he found out that a certain variety of tobacco grew very successfully in Virginia. And Virginia became a colony which was kind of dominated by tobacco plantations. Tobacco plantations require a lot of labor, so a lot of indentured servants, and eventually the indentured servants actually started coming over in like 1609. And then from 1619, they began to bring, to help with the tobacco production, they began to bring over enslaved Africans on these slave vessels. But still, I believe the original idea still was based upon the idea of indentured servitude. So you can see, in the beginning, they didn't get much done. They didn't really discover tobacco until a decade or so after they arrived. But pretty soon, they start to, primarily the Virginia colony, starts to export very, very large volumes of tobacco. That's in 1672. For instance, 17 million pounds of tobacco were exported to England. So it becomes a big, profitable industry. And that takes a lot of labor. So they developed in Virginia a plantation labor system. In the 17th century, about 8,500 indentured servants came from England. And the importation of slaves from Africa started in 1619. And 40 years later, an institution, a new form of servitude called chattel slavery, was established in our country. So we, all of a sudden, in this country that is meant to be based upon, we believe from God's point of view, Christian love and democracy, you have something that's completely outside of the principle. You have chattel slavery, whereby human beings are treated like physical property. They're bought and sold like property. And their children, the offspring of the slave, is the owner, is owned by the one who owns the parents. It's inherited access to this property. This human slaves had the same, were treated like physical property. That's what chattel slavery is like. There's many different forms of slavery. In the American colonies, we had chattel slavery. Human beings treated as property. So this plantation labor system became very successful, and it lasted for 200 years. We had plantation economics in this country for 2 centuries. It was very successful. I will tell you something, some people might not like what I say this, but when African Americans and European Americans work together, they do incredible things. And unfortunately, this is one of those examples. The plantation economy was a real winning combination because it was unprincipled, but it worked. And that became kind of a curse on our country. So this is a problem where racism began in our country. It's a problem of cognitive dissonance. What do you do if you're a Christian and you're living in a society where there's something so unchristian as chattel slavery? You have what's called cognitive dissonance. You have a problem when your conscience is troubling you,
And you have to find a way to resolve that dissonance, that disturbance in your conscience about the way these human beings are being treated. So people cannot live with cognitive dissonance. They have to resolve it. And cognitive dissonance is by intellectualizing the problem. And that intellectualization of the problem, that is a totally unprincipled concept of power, right? We know what our true parents' definition of power, it has the only basis for power is sacrificial love. That's what our true parents have taught us. Tragically, this self-serving and corrupting belief became widely shared and deeply ingrained within the thinking and society of the European colonists, including within the church. That's a fact. So, the correct way of resolving this cognitive dissonance was to eliminate slavery. That's what they should have done. They should have agreed that it had to go. Let's just go with chattel servitude. People earn their transport, after a few years you let them be free and you let them become citizens. The false resolution is to allow chattel slavery to continue, but to give it an intellectual justification. The intellectual justification was racism. Tribalism came before racism, but racism is something that emerged within the context of tribalism. And that is the denial of the God-given status of a human being based on their skin color. Non-acceptance. I don't accept you as being equal to me. That's my definition of racism. Now, I'd just like to say very quickly that there's a difference between racism and racial bias. Racism, this non-acceptance, is really, really evil. Racial bias is fallen nature. It means that I don't feel as comfortable with Sam because his ethnicity is a little different than mine. I'm a little bit different than him. I have kind of a bias against Sam. I'm not going to get into that too much, but we shouldn't confuse. Everybody has racial bias. Every one of us. If you tell a slave descendant if I tell Dennis Jackson, Dennis, you have racial bias, Dennis is going to say, yep, you're right, I do. I have racial bias. That's not the same as being racist. So we all struggle with bias, with prejudice, with preferences. We prefer. My friends are mostly white European dudes. That's a fact. My wife's friends are primarily Japanese sisters. That's her preference. Yes, that's a little fallen, but it's not the same as racism. Please don't call my wife a racist. You can say she has racial preferences. She'll say, yeah, I do. I'm sorry. We have to learn in America to overcome both racism and racial preference, but they're not the same. People throw around racism like they apply it to everything, and that's nonsense. It's not fair. It's an insult. It's another way of degrading someone. It's by labeling them to be something less. The word racist has a connotation of hate. It has a connotation of hate. We have to really not use it unless it's really, really explicit non-acceptance of another person based upon their skin color. So, what happened is, rather than this tribal arrival and integration period progressing as God intended, what we have is a divided foundation period. We have two systems. We have a compromise. And this is the beginning of what now is called, in very politically correct terminology, systemic racism. Our country became divided, two different systems, North and South. And that process, that system lasted for 167 years. This is, in a sense, what people call the original sin of our country, and we're still dealing with it. I'm going to finish up right now, okay, Luke? So there's a controversy raging in our country right now, and that is, what are the underlying roots of America? You know, our father explained in his speeches, our Reverend Moon, so clearly and articulately in his speeches, God's Hope for America in 1973, and his speeches during the bicentennial year in 1970, so clearly about the founding of America, and he put a huge importance on the Pilgrim Fathers who first came to America, the Puritan immigrants. So there's one view, the providential view, that the roots of America are the Mayflower and our Pilgrim Fathers, a religious motivation behind the founding. Its identity and its economic strength is the plantation system based upon slave labor. That's what this country is really built on. That's the core root of who we are. We're a country based upon a slave economy. Which of those two, the providential view or the materialistic view? The view that the Pilgrim Fathers, that as we were taught by our true parents, or the view that we're rooted in slavery as taught by materialist ideology? Which do you think is correct? I think it's pretty foolish to just reject ideas you don't believe in. I think you have to study them and find out exactly what they're saying, and then find out if there's any core of truth to what they're saying. My opinion is that the problem of our country is not, I'm gonna have to wrap this up. My opinion is that this country, Father did not say this. This is my opinion. But I'm gonna stand by it, that our country there's two wombs from which America comes. It comes from both our Puritan Pilgrim heritage, and it also comes from this external emphasis rooted in the slave economy. I say both are part of our DNA as a country. Now, some of you might not agree with me, but I think we have to take both of those pedigrees and deal with them, or else we'll misunderstand the burden of and responsibility of our country. One of those wombs was explained by Father, as I said in his speech. The one I would suggest you read is God's Hope for America, and the other one is the 1619 Project. These are the two most articulate statements of these two views about the founding roots of our country. The internal view emphasizes the Puritan awakening, the importance of Calvinism, the symbolic meaning of the arrival of the Mayflower at the Plymouth colony, the importance of freedom of worship, and the able-type role of the northern colonies, and the external view about the foundation of our womb of our country is that it's based upon the establishment by the European colonial powers to colonize and bring wealth to Europe from its colonial holdings. It's a commercial and materialistic view of the world. The core part of the story is the success of the tobacco plantations in Virginia, primarily from Jamestown, the plantation economy, and this part of the American story is rooted in the southern colonies. At the time of independence, 90% of enslaved Americans lived in the South, and half of those lived in Virginia, where the tobacco plantations were. Okay, I think I didn't even get past the first part of the story, but I think I'll have to end there because I got the signal from the front row. I hope there was something valuable that came from this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Uncle Jim, for that amazing sermon. Yeah, I mean, there's so much to gain from that, and it's very dense. It's a lot of information to pack and understand. From my experience, with the friends I've talked to in the current climate, a lot of young people are shaping their worldview right now, especially about these trivial topics about racism and where this country is heading. So I think the principled worldview is a really important worldview that we want to share to a lot of youth right now. And so thank you very much for offering that. Please give him one.